Wherever you're listening in the world, it's a pleasure to welcome you to IsraelCast, the podcast powered by Jewish National Fund USA, your voice in Israel. I'm Stephen Shalowitz, first reminding you that for 120 years, Jewish National Fund USA has been the premier philanthropic movement for the land and people of Israel. While best known for planting trees in Israel, JNF USA contributes to Israeli life in so many ways, including community development in the Negev and the Galilee, preservation of heritage sites, supporting people with disabilities, and connecting high school and college students to Israel. Now, to learn more and to see how you can contribute, do visit jnf.org. Once again, hope you got it, jnf.org. All right, as for this episode, you are in for a definite treat as we welcome Noah Shufutinsky, aka Westside Gravy, to the program. Now, Noah is a hip hop recording artist and producer who fuses his passion for Jewish history and culture with his musical talents to share stories relating to his personal life, as well as collective narratives of Black and Jewish communities. Now, as a rapper and producer, his art really reflects important aspects of his life, from lighthearted songs about Southern California culture to conscious tracks about his identity. And with that, it's an absolute honor, pleasure, and joy to welcome Noah Shufutinsky to IsraelCast, who joins us now via Zoom from the city of brotherly love. Of course, we're talking about Philadelphia, PA. Noah, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
Oh, we're delighted to have you. First of all, what are you doing in Philly?
So actually, this is where I finished up high school. I moved around a bunch growing up, so I got the family house out here. And yeah, I'm here for a little bit before heading back to Israel.
All right, and we're going to talk about your upcoming Israel journey and more in just a moment. But really, Noah, I would really love to take a huge, enormous, gigantic step back and have you share with us your story, your life story. I'd love our listeners to learn more about your background and your family because you have a unique setup there going on. And I just want you to share it with everybody. So go right ahead.
Yeah, so actually, I grew up in the United States. I was born in Hawaii actually, and then I moved around my entire life because my dad's actually in the Navy or was in the Navy for most of my childhood. So I was actually raised mostly in California. You know, as you can see, if you can see the California flag right here, in San Diego. So I have a lot of like those Southern California roots that kind of come out in my music, and that I'm really connected to having grown up, spending most of the time there in that sort of cultural environment. And yeah, like I moved around a lot growing up, so that definitely had an effect on my Jewish upbringing, the types of Jewish communities I was involved in, because it was really dependent on where exactly I would be living. So I think that that's sort of where a lot of my own personal like connection to my family and my family's connection to Judaism comes from, because regardless of whatever type of congregation or synagogue we were able to be a part of or not able to be a part of, depending where we were at, I was raised in a very like strong and proud Black Jewish household growing up, and I think that that's where a lot of my pride and my inspiration and connection to my identity comes from. It really starts in the home, and it only gets richer when I'm able to share that with the community.
And talk a little bit about your Black identity as well.
Yeah, so that comes from like the African American experience of having family and ancestors who were brought over as slaves and persevered and liberated themselves and fought to be able to achieve everything that they were able to. So I have like roots in, I mean, obviously originally in most likely West Africa, because that's where a majority of African American, Black American people come from. But as far as in the United States, my grandma was actually born in Mississippi. Her parents were born in Mississippi, and they left and moved to California due to Jim Crow in the 1950s. And that's sort of where the California connection comes in. So,
Got it. And that's on your mom's side,
yeah, that's on my mom's side.
right? And your dad's parents were from where
Yes.
originally?
So my dad was actually born in Russia. He was born in the Soviet Union, and he came to the U.S. as a refugee in 1981 after bouncing around different like refugee camps and facilities in Europe for a few months.
Those are two very different cultural backgrounds in many ways. How'd they meet?
So they actually met. So my mom was born and raised in California, in like the Inland Empire, and then moved to LA. And then my dad first came to New York, to Brooklyn, actually, to Canarsie, it's an area in Brooklyn, in the 80s. And then in the later 80s, moved out to California, to Los Angeles, and they met out there.
Now, listen, let's talk a little bit about your rapping. But before we get to that, Westside Gravy, what's the backstory behind that?
That's $1 million
And
question.
and is it okay that I call you Noah instead of Westside Gravy?
Yeah, that's yeah, that's totally cool. Whatever's easiest for you. I've gotten used to responding to Noah and Israel, Noah, Westside Gravy, one or the other. So
And you can call me Steven. You don't have to call me by my rap name.
yeah, what's the rap name?
I'll tell you after we stop recording.
Okay, that sounds good. So the West Side that comes from California right there. It comes from my upbringing in San Diego. Like if I think this is sort of a story that anyone who's like a military child will be able to understand. There's like people ask you where you're from, and it's always like, oh, what do I tell the person this time? Do I tell them where I just moved from, or do I tell them where I was born, but maybe I didn't live in the place I was born for like a long time? So for me, like San Diego, California is as close to a hometown as I'm gonna have because that's where I spent most of my upbringing. That's where I really grew up. So that's where the West Side comes from, and the gravy. That's still the jury's still out on that one. That's $1 million question. I haven't shared it yet.
You mean we can't get an exclusive here on IsraelCast?
Not yet. I don't know if the world's ready for it.
But there is a method to the madness, is what you're saying, in terms
Yeah.
of the selection of the word gravy.
Yeah, there's a meaning behind it. There's a whole meaning behind it. There's a story behind it. So you're gonna have to stay tuned and keep up.
Okay, I'll tell you what, can we make a little bit of a deal here, Noah? When you're ready, would you mind giving us that exclusive and sharing it with us here on IsraelCast?
I got you.
All right?
I got you. I'll hit you up.
All right. Everyone heard it. Our listeners around the world are our witnesses. Well, listen, how did you get into rapping then? How did you gravitate to it? I mean, I must say that I've listened to your music. I am not a rap aficionado myself. Before we started rolling, I told you that I used to have a Latin music show on radio in Singapore. So Latin's my deal, jazz is, Motown. But I will say I find your work very, very accessible. It's not full of four-letter words. I think you can listen to it in mixed company. It's actually very clever. So congratulations. But again, backstory on how you got into rap and how you gravitated to it.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think that I'm glad you picked that up about sort of the accessibility of it. And I think it's actually cool that you mentioned all these other genres of music that you're more familiar with or listening to. So I grew up in a very musical household, I'd say. My parents played a lot of different types of music for me growing up. And I think that that's actually where a lot of my influence comes from. So whether it was from like reggae music and like Bob Marley, to a lot of old soul music, you know, listening to James Brown, Nina Simone, Sam Cooke, and also some more like California, you know, centric, so like older oldies, as I would say, like lowrider music, Richie Valens and stuff. I really picked up a lot from that because for me, what was unique about all these different genres was that these are people who are coming from an environment that I didn't come from a specific like life that I didn't come from and I didn't live, even in a completely different time period. But what they're able to do with their music is to capture that time period and that environment where they grew up and present it to me in a way that's accessible for me to get a window into someone else's life. And I think that's what's special about music in general. And I think that with hip hop music, especially a lot of the hip hop that I was raised listening to as well as these other genres, it was a lot of West Coast hip hop that was storytelling. It was really based like artists like Tupac and E40 who find unique and creative ways to use words and rhythms and a lot of times samples of even this oldies that I would listen to growing up, incorporate that into something that sounds like a place in California where they were from, and that I can associate that. Um, and they're telling a story that's something that I didn't grow up with, that I didn't necessarily grow up familiar with, but they gave me that sense of familiarity through the music and through the focus on storytelling. So that's sort of how it fit in with all the other music I grew up listening to. And I think that I don't know exactly why. I still try to figure that out myself. But that's sort of the music that I automatically sort of gravitated towards creating when it came to expressing myself.
So it's really at the end of the day for you about storytelling, isn't it? And it's through the medium of rap.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. And like I love rapping. Like that's the other part. Like I can't figure out exactly why. That's the genre I sort of went with, but like I really have a love for it. I think that it's unique. I mean, I listen to all different genres of music and be able to appreciate it. And also like when I hear someone do like pull off certain rhythms or flows or rhyme patterns, specifically in hip hop, it just really speaks to me, and I like to do that myself.
Well, there are two songs in particular I'd love for you to weigh in on. And the first one is called Diaspora. And I encourage really all of our listeners to check it out on YouTube if they haven't done so already. Just put in Noah Diaspora and I'm sure it'll pop up. Okay. We don't have to go even spell your last name or Noah Westside Gravy or Noah Shufutinsky, etc. And it'll all pop up. And I must say, I was really quite bowled over by the storytelling, we'll use that word again, and the message that you had in that tune. And I started jotting down actually some of the lyrics. And I thought, I want to ask Noah about this one. And then I thought, I want to ask Noah about this one. I want him to comment on that one. There were so many wonderful nuggets in there. And there was one in particular that I'll just throw out here that I'd love you to just sort of weigh in on, because I think it'll dovetail into the latter part of our conversation. And it was, quote, "Say you value social justice. Are you kidding us? What the hell gives you the right to tell me who's indigenous?" And I thought that was really quite powerful.
Thank you. Yeah, honestly, like this is I can get a little bit like into the technical aspect of it and
Please.
kind of connect it. So when I was writing that specific song, like there's a whole story behind it. But I remember when I was coming up to this lyric, I knew I wanted to bring up the topic of like us as a Jewish people taking control of our own narrative and telling our own story and talking about our own connection to our homeland in an authentic and powerful way. And that includes like the story of the Jewish people being indigenous to the land, and now that we're able to physically reconnect with it, it's like embracing that fully. So I knew that I wanted to use that. So like that was sort of a line in my head. Like I understood exactly the point that I wanted to get across with that line. And I was coming up with, how I was going to lead up to it. And it's sort of like fighting against this idea of you go to college campuses nowadays, you go to, I mean, it's expanded beyond college campuses. You go to all sorts of different spaces that purport to be for social justice. They say that they're all about social justice and liberation. Yet one of the most successful indigenous liberation movements on earth in the history of human people, which is Zionism, which is the Jewish people being able to come back and reconnect with their homeland, is being cast aside as something that it's not. And for me, that's about us taking the narrative and saying, like, you say you claim that you want to support social justice movements, like you got to be joking. So when I originally actually wrote that lyric, I was like, so you all about like social justice? Are you kidding? What the hell gives you the right to tell me who's indigenous? Because it's me saying like these people who are completely not connected to who I am. They're not part of my community. They don't have the right to tell my story, and the story of my people are the ones who are trying to control my narrative and speak over me. And this is sort of me saying, you know what, like we're not gonna waste our time listening to that. They have no right to do it. And I remember writing it, and it was more of a personal thing at first. It was like, you say you value social justice. Are you kidding me? What the hell gives you the right to tell me who's indigenous? And like the rhyme scheme matched up before. And I was actually talking to my dad, and he's like, why don't you say, are you kidding us? Because, I mean, obviously it works with the flow, and it tells more of like the collective narrative, and it's more unifying. So, and I was like, yeah, like I feel like that really makes, the story feel more like it talks more to the collective Jewish story.
Noah, I want to go back to this notion of Zionism in just a moment. And I also want to talk about the process that you employ in writing your tunes, especially that one, Diaspora. But I want to pick up on something that you just said. It's about others not defining who we are. And one of the things that I've noticed in my conversations, both here on IsraelCast, as well as watching the conversations on Zionism that JNF has launched this whole year. I know you've been a part of that. We had Ben M. Freeman, for example, who wrote Jewish Pride. We had Amy Albertson, episode 127, your buddy, fellow Californian. And she was, like I said, episode 127, just a couple episodes ago. And this is a constant theme that keeps coming up. Don't define me. We should define ourselves. And I think that's a huge paradigm shift compared to the way the thinking has been about the identity of the Jewish people. And I'd love you to expand a little bit more on that.
Yeah, definitely. I think that something that I talk a lot about, and we mentioned it a little bit in that episode about like the conversations on Zionism, also with Chen Mazig and Isabella Khazan and Amy. I think that a big issue that that we as a Jewish community have is we've been in the diaspora for so long
Mhm.
that all these labels and boxes that people come up to categorize people don't define us because our origins predate them. So before there was ever a European concept of race, the Jewish people existed. We weren't even in Europe yet. By the time we arrived in Europe forcibly, there like it didn't work. Like it didn't fit this idea of race that was created. It didn't fit our origins because we predated that. Coming to the United States, where there are different constructions of race that don't necessarily look at ethnic origin, but look more so just at specific things like skin color, that now are being challenged as more people are coming out and talking about the issues of like colorism and how much more nuanced it is. Even those don't, you can't put them on the Jewish people, on the people that predates that by thousands of years, on a nation of people. the different categories that existed throughout the Middle East, maybe in Middle Eastern diaspora for a certain period of time may have been more understanding. But once you get like issues as far as European and Arab imperialism that try and force linguistic and ethnic identities onto people who are indigenous to that land or who've been scattered and have a diaspora throughout that land, once you get those placed on them, they don't work for the Jewish people because we predate that. And I think that part of, recognizing who we are and telling our own story is coming to terms with the fact that it's 100% okay, and more than okay, it's good and important to recognize how much the diaspora has influenced the Jewish people and how much the Jewish people have influenced the diaspora countries where we've lived in. And also to remember that before that, we came from somewhere, and we're at a place now where we can physically have our connection to that place where we come from. And I think that that is not only something that's going to happen by all of us getting on an airplane and moving back, or like obviously not everyone is going to be able to live there or stay there and only stay in our own place, but in our minds recognizing that it's okay for us to tell our own story and to define ourselves, because we're not in a position where we have to confine ourselves to the boxes and constructions that diaspora societies have forced on the Jewish people.
Yeah, I totally agree. Now, you just mentioned Chen Mazig, you invoked his name. Of course, he was one of our really early guests, I think a couple of years ago here on IsraelCast. So we want to give him a shout out. And you were on a panel that he moderated called Young Jews Talking Justice with Chen, with, as you mentioned, Amy Albertson. She was our recent guest. All of those conversations can be found. We want to let our listeners know on youtube.com/Zionism Studios. Once again, youtube.com/Zionism Studios, as well as all of our IsraelCast podcast episodes. All of our conversations are there as well. Before we get to Zionism, before we get further into your music, as long as we mentioned that gathering that you had, what was the key message you hoped actually that people would take away from that session of Young Jews Talking Justice? And by the way, that must have been an incredible experience and a lot of energy with all of you coming together.
Yeah, it was really cool because I've talked to each individual, one of them, one on one, usually over like social media in these days. So it was cool to just be in one space where all of our voices get to like bounce off each other and hear like the amazing things that Amy and Isabella had to say, and also Chen as moderator, who's again, like you mentioned, he's an early guest. He's someone who I think has inspired us all. It was amazing to be in the same space and talk to all of them about similar ideas and also bring a little bit of our own backgrounds to it. And I think that really what I want people to take away is that our generation, like we have the power to completely push forward in the struggles that our parents' generation, paved the way for. So like for me, I know that my background is coming as a Black American Jew and a Russian American Jew, specifically like post-Soviet Russian American Jew. I come from a people who've been forcibly disconnected from their homeland or attempted to forcibly disconnect from their homeland, whether that was the roots on my mom's side, whether that was the roots on my dad's side, where they're forced to adapt to diaspora culture, but still they made the effort to make everything available to me, to make sure I had the opportunity to be able to explore our roots and take pride in our identity. And it's up to us to push that forward, that we're not going to have to sacrifice who we are. We're not going to have to hide who we are. We're not going to have to force it to fit into boxes, because our ancestors didn't do that, and they made it available to us to be able to expand the way we think and the way we define ourselves. So it's up to us to continue to tell that story. And the next part of that story is recognizing that we're blessed to live in a time where we're able to know where our homeland is. We're able to experience that and advocate for it and still make sure we're defending it.
By the way, Noah, have you been to Russia? And
Yeah, I have.
what was that like? And you've been also to Africa.
I haven't been to Africa yet. That's next on my list. I wanted to actually plan a trip, and it got a little bit difficult because of COVID travel restrictions and all that. But yeah, I want to go to West Africa. My older brother's been to West Africa. I've been to Russia. And of course, I've been to Israel, and it was really interesting to be in Russia and see like literally the apartment building where my dad was brought home from the hospital. That was cool for me, and to learn a little bit more about like the diaspora experience.
Where in Russia was he born?
He was born in Moscow.
Okay. And what was that experience like for you?
It was cool. I actually have some family who still lives there, so it was really interesting because it felt like so much stuff is going to be similar just because of things in my family, like cultural things. The language, I don't speak Russian, but I can understand quite a bit of it. I can read it pretty decently. That and like obviously the food that I grew up with plenty of Russian food in my house, or whenever I went to my babushka and dedushka's house, my grandma and grandfather. Um, so like some of that was familiar, but it was also interesting to be a place where it really did feel like in many ways a completely different world from being in the U.S.
No, I'm looking for a good borscht recipe.
Honestly, my dad might be able to help you there. My dad, I don't even know if he completely has a recipe, if he just knows how to make it and and goes until it's just right. But
Listen, tell him I'd love to do a Zoom borscht lesson with him.
honestly, yeah, he's got the Russian food on lock. Thank God.
All right. All right. I'm all in. Well, speaking of identity, though, is people use the term Jews of color. And it seems, Noah, that I don't say we, meaning me, because I don't like to, but society tends to label people. And I'm wondering if you can really just address that. What's your response? Because Jews come in all different stripes, all different shapes, sizes, and colors. And a Jew is a Jew is a Jew.
Right. So I think that that's a really interesting topic, and it really takes a lot of like nuance and to be able to talk about it and understanding also that it's going to vary depending on where you are, because that's really a concept that's geographically based as well. Like it's geographically based because societies in certain regions have different conceptions of like the importance of color. So the first thing like I'll say is I definitely have been in plenty in Jewish spaces where I've experienced like alienation or exclusion because I'm black and or just because I don't look Jewish in the words of whoever is looking at me and has that construction in their mind. In the United States, I've experienced that. Um, so I think that the idea and the fact of like there is a group of people who functionally are people of color and the construction of how it's viewed in the United States, and who are Jewish and who face certain obstacles because of that within the Jewish community and also with like outside of the Jewish community. I've gotten a lot of non-Jewish people who are like, "What? How are you Jewish? There's no way you can be Jewish if you're black." And that's actually something that happens a lot as well. Like that's a reality on the ground, and I think that within the Jewish community, it's our responsibility to really take that a Jew is a Jew is a Jew is a Jew and run with it. And that's something that I've seen a lot within my generation, and I think it's important because if we want to make sure that everyone is feeling included, then we have to make sure we live up to that and don't always question people because of like the basis of their skin. And also, it's important for us to recognize that that doesn't come from a Jewish tradition. That's actually something that Jewish people have adopted in the diaspora and in specific diasporas as well. Um, so I think that like when it comes to the idea and like the term Jews of color, the way I view it is that's something that can be like a working term in the United States. That's sort of the way I view it. It's not personally, I prefer to identify very specifically I'm a black Jew because that's going to have its own experience and its own background and baggage compared to someone who's an Asian Jew or who's a Latino Jew, or other types of people who would fall into this very broad category of Jews of color, including Mizrahi Jews from all over the diaspora, the Mizrahi diaspora. So I personally prefer that amount of specificity to give each identity the respect it deserves. And I also understand why people sort of latch on and use that terminology in the context of the United States. And I think part of us continuing to like decolonize our identity is to recognize that as a community, we don't necessarily need to always hold on to these concepts that were born in the United States. Because this idea of people of color doesn't necessarily translate to Israel. And I have like quite a few funny stories about that of when I've gone to Israel and tried to use American style terms to explain to people about my background. Um, and there in Israel, no one is ever asking me about my background because they're questioning if I'm Jewish. That's not something I've personally experienced. I'm sure maybe people have. I haven't. Um, for me, it's always someone wants to know like where your family's from, and I tell them, and they're like, okay, cool. Tell your whole family to come home because they're more used to seeing people from all around the Jewish diaspora, like coming kibbutz galuyot, like really in gathering of the exiles. But there are plenty of times where I've been to Israel and someone's asked, "What's your background?" and I tell them I'm black and Russian. And then they're kind of confused. They're like, "Black, but you're like the same skin color as me," and I'm like Moroccan. So like, and I'm like, "No, I mean African American." And they're like, "Oh, I'm Moroccan, so I'm also African. So we're the same. Like, are you Moroccan?" I have to explain to them, no, in like America, there's a whole different like set of terminology and terms. So I mean, I think that just goes to show that it changes depending on where you're at. So it's important not to export those concepts to other places and those conflicts to other places.
That's why I think it's just best to say that you're Jewish. One thing that I've mentioned here countless times on IsraelCast is a quote from the late Lubavitcher Rebbe, who used to say, labels are for clothes. In other words, when asked about if you're Orthodox, you Reform, you're Reconstructionist or whatever, because if you're Jewish, full stop in the end. And so there you go. I want to get back to your music though, and then I want to talk about things like your Magen David that you're wearing, your tattoo, Zionism. So back to your music, I'm really curious. What is the process that you employ when you're writing a tune? And then, what melodies do you select? How do you select the melodies? Because clearly, like when you did Diaspora, that was a riff on Havanagila, which really worked. I love that. But then how do you approach then the lyrics? And I mean, do they come to you sort of like in the shower when you're waking up in the morning? Is many people get inspiration when they're most relaxed?
Yeah. So yeah, the lyrics they kind of hit me like at all different times. Sometimes depending on what type of song it is, and I think you kind of are able to see a reflection of that like in certain songs. It's like, okay, clearly Noah was upset or troubled by something when he wrote this. Oh, clearly Westside was, was feeling super happy and optimistic when he wrote this. Or so I think that that's something that's really unique because it really captures a snapshot of the moment. And I try whenever lyrics come to me, not even always to write them down, but to like think them over many times in my head. And then eventually like I'll write them down once I sort of really feel it. But usually like the process for coming up with a song, because I produce all my own beats too. So like a process usually is I'll have like an idea for a topic or a couple lyrics will pop into my head about a certain theme that usually matches whatever I'm dealing with at the time emotionally. And then once I have that like in my mind, I could kind of feel like a tempo. So then I'll like take note of that and write down maybe the couple lyrics ideas that I have. And then I'll go and I'll work on a beat for that sort of matches that vibe. So a lot of times I'll start. I mean, it really depends what I'm going for. If it's something that's more cultural, then I'll start with some sort of instrumentation or melodies that like reflect that element of the culture that I'm bringing to the song, and then build on that with like really much more hip hop influence. So with Diaspora, like I knew I wanted to do something with Hava Nagila, and the original beat. It's funny, like if I played it for you, I don't even know if I'd be able to find it. It was sort of a typical like, oh, Hava Nagila rap beat. But then I decided I was like, I want to slow it down a little bit and give it that like West Coast bounce that it has. Um, and then from there, I actually sat with that for months because I was like, oh, this could be something special. Like I know that I want this to have like a message to it. But I was working on another project at the time, so I wasn't sure exactly what it was going to be, and I actually sat with that for a couple months. So it's kind of an abnormal way of producing that.
I want to capture something that you said a moment ago. You said, when I'm West Side, I, and then you said, when I'm Noah, I.
Oh,
So do you compose as Noah, or do you compose as West Side? In other words, do you take on a different persona depending on what you're doing?
Um, I think that's actually an interesting question because I actually said that not really thinking too much of it. I was just kind of giving examples of like, oh, this song was when Noah's feeling this way or when Westside was feeling this way. So it's not something that I'm particularly conscious of. But I think definitely I try and bring aspects of what I'm actually feeling into my musical like persona, into my musical.
Yeah, because that tune Diaspora, I don't know if you have just the lyrics printed out, but it's really a remarkable poem more than anything else.
Thank you.
So congrats on that. And then can you briefly just talk about 40 Acres?
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that one. So actually, 40 Acres came together. That's one of the songs that honestly, I'm trying to think back if I came up with like which part of the song I came up with first because it came together pretty fast before I released it. So I knew that I wanted to release a song for Juneteenth, which is like also what I did last year when I released a song called Moses, and I knew I wanted it to have a certain like very hip hop sound, but also taking inspiration from West African music because that's where people come from, and the idea of like 40 acres and a mule is very specific to the Black American experience, which is has roots in West Africa. So for me, I started out sort of with like the rhythm and a little bit of like the bass. And then I threw like the vocal sample on there, which is from it's a sample of a West African singer, just like a vocal sample. It's that you can that I was able to get online and license and everything. And then I added some other. So that was like the only sample actually. Everything else I played using different West African instruments mainly from like the area that used to be like the Kingdom of Mali in West Africa. And also I tried to throw some of the West African drums into the song, still picking up like a hip hop rhythm, but showing that like connection um, of like something that's historically something that we as Black Americans are rooted in, and also something that in modern day Black Americans being the creators of hip hop music in the United States that we're rooted in that. And the lyrics really came to me just because um, I felt like a lot of people nowadays are the same way as they're trying to make Judaism be something that is always like something you feel like you have to defend. A lot of people are doing that to the black identity, in my personal opinion. A lot of people are making me feel like the black identity is only valid when it's talking about a struggle against someone else. It's only valid when it's talking about the hardships of it and not necessarily actually celebrating it. And the song 40 Acres is a little bit of, it's talking about a struggle. It's talking about the history of slavery and reparations. And so it definitely is related to that, but it's also a response to that. In my second verse, I say, listen, I'm sick of being portrayed a perpetual victim, abilities viewed with restriction, or like basically I'm talking about the way that, around Juneteenth, I'm scrolling on social media right before I wrote that second verse. And I'm seeing some people who are not from the black community who are trying to say, oh, maybe we shouldn't celebrate Juneteenth because even though people were free from slavery, there are still all these other obstacles to deal with. And for me, that's like spitting on the face of my ancestors who, yeah, they had a lot of issues to deal with it. They're still fighting, and they're going to celebrate, the strides that we've made to liberate ourselves. And it's important to honor that. And I feel like there are a lot of people who are trying to consistently take anything that we have to celebrate as black people and also as Jewish people away from us. So for me, that song is like, listen, like I'm still waiting on the 40 Acres and a Mule. That's American history we don't learn in school. But no, we're still going to celebrate this. We're still going to connect to our roots, and we're not going to make it put the burden on our shoulders of fixing the issues that everyone else created.
Well, we've talked a lot about the audio. I want to talk a little bit about Noah's visual right now. So let's start with your Magen David, which you wear very proudly.
Yeah, thank you. This was actually a birthday present from my mom last year.
It's beautiful.
Thank
My
you.
birthday's September 8th to your mom. Just message to her, by the way.
I got you.
And so you wear it with great pride. And do people comment? What's the reaction?
Yeah. I mean, I get a lot of different reactions. I think a lot of times the things that really give me like power, especially this past May when there's a lot of anti-Semitism going on. I was walking in Los Angeles, and it was a time where there were like some people driving by shouting like anti-Semitic things in the area around that time. But I got a lot of people who stopped me in the street, were like, "Hey, man, I like your necklace," or like I'll be walking and like there'll just be a fellow Jewish person who'll just nod and say, if it's Shabbat, Shabbat Shalom, like automatically brings like that sense of community. And that's something that I really appreciate.
So you like that response then?
Yeah, I like that response. I think it's also important to have that representation of, Jewish people in all different walks of life, whether, whatever your job is, if you're a doctor or a rapper, if you're a student or a teacher, like who are still like carrying on in all different aspects of life, but still, being proud of who they are and expressing that in the many different ways there are.
Right. I think it's beautiful. And let's talk about another visual, your tattoos.
Hmm.
Listen, Noah, we're from a different generation. Tattoos aren't necessarily my thing, but they are your thing. And I want you to show our viewers that are watching this on YouTube your tattoos and describe your tattoos for our listeners on podcast.
Yeah, so the first one that I have that I got is on my right arm. It's basically like the outline of California with a waving California flag in there. You can see, and the little star down where San Diego is. So for me, that was just something that I
You want
wanted
to
to.
give a shout out to the tattoo artist because, like I said, I'm not a tattoo guy, but whomever did that did an awfully nice job.
Yeah, it's this guy Sean Roche from. He actually has done all my tattoos. He's in this area
He's in
of
Philly.
yeah, in the Philadelphia area, in a place called Louder Than Bombs Tattoo in like Cheltenham. So that's the artist who did them all. And yeah, I've gone back to him for like all my tattoos after I got this first one because
He did a nice job, by the way.
thank you. Yeah, he did an amazing job. I was really really excited about it.
Right. I'm not going to be going into a tattoo parlor anytime soon or anytime, but for those interested, they know who to go to. And then talk to us about the other ones because I was seeing some Hebrew on your arm.
Yeah, so the next two that I got, I'll actually show you like within the same year I got the Lion of Judah right here. So it's like the one that's on the Jerusalem flag, and then I got the outline of the continent of Africa with the Pan African flag in there, the tricolor. And for me, that was also a little bit of like a personal play on diaspora. In my heart, I hold Jerusalem in Africa, um, and just sort of a representation of that because that's a part of who I am, and that's something that I wanted to express. And then the most recent one I got is the line from Tehillim, Im eshkachech Yerushalayim tishkach yamini. So that's from Tehillim in the Tanakh. That's basically saying it's like stressing the importance of Jerusalem. If I'd forget Jerusalem, then make my right arm forget like what it's supposed to do, like forget its ability. And for me, I think that that's so special because it's something that dates back so long ago, to a time period, even like in the earliest of Jewish exiles, where we still stress the importance of maintaining our connection to Jerusalem. And that's something that resonates with the Jewish people all over the world. Whether I'm in the United States, whether I'm in the UK, Jewish people see that and they find some way to connect with it. Or whether I'm in Israel and I'm getting falafel and the guy goes, "Oh, I like your tattoo."
Yeah, I was going to ask, what's the response? Because they're all very different. I don't know if you ever wear a tank top, for example, where people can see that full California uh, representation on your upper arm.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, like the response wherever I'm at it is I haven't really gotten any negativity, any negative comments about it. People have thought it's cool, and in Israel, it's funny because like tattoos aren't the most accepted thing typically, like as people would imagine in Judaism. But so many people in Israel have tattoos, and like I get a bunch of compliments there actually, especially like people see this, they're like, "Oh, it's so cool! Like it's crazy you come from the diaspora, but you still have such a strong connection to the homeland." So.
What do your parents make of your um, proud Jewish heritage that you're expressing, your music? Um, I mean, they must be proud of you, I'd imagine.
Yeah, I mean, my parents are the inspiration. My whole family is. My older brother, who's actually in Israel as a lone soldier now, like my whole family sort of, I think, contributed to who I am and this pride that I have right now. So I think they're very proud. I mean, they also grew up playing a lot of the music I got inspired by, so they definitely are owed some credit for that. So there's definitely a connection there.
Indeed. So let's talk about travel just for a moment. So before we talk about Israel, where you're going, I want you to share with our listeners what you're going to be doing there once you step off the plane. I understand is as we record this, actually, you're getting ready to record in Europe.
Yeah, I actually have a couple performances out there. So I'm going to Paris tomorrow, actually. I'm going to be there for a gig for European Jewish Organization, European Jewish Association. Actually, I'm doing like two performances with them, and then I'm going to be going to England. So I'm going to be actually performing a couple songs at my friend Josh Brennan. He's also a Jewish singer-songwriter based in London, getting ready to move to Israel as well. Hopefully, as soon as possible. So I'm gonna be doing a couple songs that we have together that are unreleased so far. But his show in London, and then we have a show together that we're doing in Liverpool. And I've never been to Liverpool, so it's gonna be a first for me. I'm excited.
Oh, that's very nice. Well, I'm sure you'll get some Beatles inspiration up there.
Yeah, I'm excited about that. All the sightseeing even before the concert. So.
Sure, absolutely. So let's talk about Israel then, because I understand you're planning to move to Israel. That
Yep.
was that was the word on the street, Noah.
Yeah, it's true.
Okay, so what are you going to do once you step off the plane?
The first thing I'm gonna do is go get some kebab because I've said this many times. I'll die on this hill. Hadera, specifically my neighborhood, Givat Olga, has the best kebab, the best shashlik in the world. Like, if someone can find better ones, like, let me know, but I don't think it's possible. So that's the first thing I'm gonna do. But yeah, I'm gonna be out there working on music for a little bit and then going to the IDF. That's how the plan is right now.
So will you be a lone soldier? Will you do it for a year or the full-on IDF program?
I think it's gonna be a little bit different for me because I'm a little bit older. I graduated university first, so I actually need to double check. It depends the exact time of like my aliyah date um, for the time period, but it would be like at least 2 years, I think, for my age.
Are you training already?
My typical workout routines. I'm running some push-ups.
Okay. I think you're going to have to up the game there, Noah, if you want to.
Yeah, that's what I'm gonna be doing. I'm back in Israel. I'm gonna be back on my Israel workout routine, which includes a lot more running.
Yeah. And again, your family's behind all this.
Yeah, they support it. I mean, of course, they're gonna be, as any parent would be, thinking about their kid and any kind of situation. But yeah, they're supportive, always have been. And my dad was in the U.S. military for a really long time, so that's something and I have like lines of family who are in the United States military on my mom's side, so it's always something that's been like valued and respected in my family.
So I know it's in your blood, really.
Yeah.
Now, speaking of travel to Israel, I also understand that you went on JNF's alternate break. That's that volunteer program. And where did you go? What did you do? What did you experience? What was your takeaway?
Yeah, so that was, man, that was like honestly one of the best trips of my life. So
Yeah, I've
I
heard only amazing things about it.
it's so amazing. Like it was so amazing. I actually, it was I wasn't even necessarily considering like going on it early on. Like I wasn't super familiar, or wasn't even like super aware because I was in college. I wasn't even thinking necessarily about like going to Israel on that winter break. And then I found out about the trip in like October and November. I was like, oh, I could go to Israel like in a month and see this part of Israel I've never seen before. Do like volunteer work. It's with JNF, of course. Like I knew what JNF was growing up. So I was like, oh, this sounds amazing. And it was just an absolutely like I don't even have like words to describe how amazing of a trip it was because I went on the trip to the Arava Desert, so it was way in the south of Israel. I'd never been there before, even in trips that I'd gone to Israel before. That being able to be there with a group of people who were dedicated to learning about a part of Israel they'd never been before, about impacts as far as like climate and environmental work that was being done down there. It was just super cool and really eye opening to learn about a whole new aspect of Israel that I hadn't really been able to see firsthand before.
Have you considered writing a song about it?
I mean, I definitely I when I was on that trip, I wrote a lot of lyrics. It definitely reinforced my love for Israel and my
You
love for
need
the.
to do like a whole Arava album.
You know what? I would. There's some good. There's actually a very famous Israeli group that's from not too far. We were on Kibbutz Ketorah, and there's a famous Israeli group, three singers, the Aiwa. They have like the song Habib Galbi that blew up, and was like very popular in Israel. And they're from not too far from that kibbutz, so definitely I see where the inspiration comes from.
Absolutely. How great is that? Well, I want to talk a little bit about Zionism because, as you know, JNF has launched, Jewish National Fund has launched a whole program called Conversations on Zionism, really to reclaim the beauty, the inclusivity of what Zionism is all about. You've been a part of that whole program, as we mentioned, with your participation in the panel with Chen, with Amy, and with the others. And I'm just really wondering, at the end of the day, Noah, what does Zionism mean to you, and how would you define Zionism?
So I think the definition of Zionism has been like pretty clear throughout history. It's the Jewish right to return to our homeland, to live in our homeland, and to maintain our connection to our indigenous homeland. And I think that that has special meaning to me, and is going to have special meaning to everyone based on their background. So one thing that I really took away from that panel that Chen specifically said, and Isabella also spoke about, was the idea of Zionism being like a physical lifeline for their families. Like when they had to flee anti-Semitic violence, they fled to Israel, and it wasn't just fleeing one place to get to another; it was coming home. And I think that as Zionists, we have the responsibility, and as Jewish people, we have the responsibility to make sure that that dream is attainable to everyone, even people who are having difficulties getting back to Israel, or are worried about like not necessarily feeling accepted. It's our responsibility to make sure that every Jewish person is going to be accepted in the Jewish homeland. And my personal, feeling like my own, it resonates personally with me because even more than just being a physical lifeline, or I guess in a different vein than being just a physical lifeline, it's also like a spiritual and a cultural lifeline. So even in the Soviet Union, where you weren't allowed to practice Judaism, a lot of Jews who came from the Soviet Union to Israel have, had certain levels of like struggles because they don't have a religious element to their Jewish tradition. But the dream of returning to Israel, the dream of coming back to Jerusalem is something that was always alive. And even when it was illegal for them to go to synagogue, even when it was illegal for them to pray in communities publicly, or even like privately, people had to worry about this. Um, Even when they were under physical threat of being able to express their Jewish identity, that's one thing that they still kept was their connection to Israel because they knew that that's where they come from and they knew that that's the homeland. And I think that that's what saved, so many Jewish people who may have had to struggle through times where they weren't allowed to practice specific rituals, but they knew and they had the hope that one day they'd be able to go to a place where they could reconnect with that.
Noah, we've been chatting for probably about 50 minutes or so, and no pun intended, but I feel like you haven't missed a beat. I mean, you are so incredibly articulate, intelligent, content and delivery. And I know you're a recent college grad. Congratulations. You went to GW, right?
Yeah.
In DC, one of my all-time favorite cities. And I'm just wondering, when you were on campus, were your peers as enlightened, is articulate, let's use that word, as you are about issues and about Judaism, about Israel, about Zionism?
I think a lot of them were. I think it was in a certain way, it was like a microcosm of the world. So I definitely had a very strong Jewish community um, who who was there to really support me through all of this, through any obstacles I had dealing with campus anti-Semitism. That's, I think, kind of typical, sadly, nowadays. And also to empower me beyond that, to empower me to explore elements of Jewish culture and Jewish tradition, and specifically Israel, that I hadn't experienced before. Like, I actually never been to Israel before freshman year. I went on Taglit on Birthright with my Hillel. So I think in that way, yeah, I had a lot of really enlightened fellow students and also like staff at Hillel and throughout Jewish life, to really help me, uh, sort of like on my journey of connecting with my people. And also, I had a lot of people from other communities who were interested and equally as interested in learning about, Judaism and connections to their culture and how we can, coexist. I mean, and there also was a good amount of like anti-Semitism that also targets Jewish people based on our connection to Israel. And I think that for a lot of people in my generation, especially people who have roots, either as a result of like the Mizrahi diaspora, Mizrahi expulsion, and also the Soviet diaspora, I think a lot of us are familiar with that already. I think a lot of us, we heard the stories of our parents, we heard the stories of our grandparents and what they dealt with and what they experienced. And the type of anti-Semitism we're seeing now is a lot more reminiscent of that than maybe other things, other generations were more prepared to fight. And I think that we've been empowered by previous generations to make sure that we can continue the fight, to stand up for Jewish people.
No, I just have to say, I think the future of Israel and the Jewish people are in excellent hands with people like you. So really, kol hakavod for everything that you're doing, for your music, for your outreach, and just for your pride in Judaism, which I think is actually quite infectious. So on that very positive note, we want to wish you truly much hatzlacha in everything that Noah or Westside touches. And one of these days, he's going to come back, right? And tell us what gravy actually means. And I guess you're going to keep that name Westside Gravy even when you go to Israel, aren't you?
Yeah, I already have it translated into Hebrew for some of my more recent Hebrew songs.
You mean is in Hebrew letters, Westside Gravy?
Yeah, transliterated rather. Yeah.
Transliterated. I like
Yeah.
that. Well, listen, maybe you'll translate West Side, the word for West Side, and the word for gravy in Hebrew, and then you can also have like a double or a triple alias. How's that? But in
That
the
might work.
meantime, before you actually do that, we just want to thank you so much, really, for joining us here on this episode of IsraelCast. And once again, lots of luck in everything that you do, Noah. And of course, we'll have info about Noah. Shufutinsky, as we said, his alias is Westside Gravy. We're going to have info about both gentlemen's on the show notes page of our website, jnf.org/IsraelCast. And before we move on with housekeeping, just love to remind you that Jewish National Fund USA believes, as we've been saying, that the time has indeed come for us to reclaim the narrative, take ownership of the word Zionism, and show the world how beautiful, inclusive, and inspirational Zionism really is. So do join Jewish National Fund USA's Conversations on Zionism, Reclaiming the Narrative. It's a whole year-long program which will educate, engage, and inspire really on the true meaning of the word Zionism and reclaim its true meaning in all its glory. Once again, go to youtube.com/Zionism Studios. Once again, youtube.com/Zionism Studios. You will learn a ton, I promise you. Now, we do release new episodes of IsraelCast every other Wednesday. And just so you never miss an episode, subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. Simply search for IsraelCast. How easy is that? And don't forget to rate and review us to make it easier for more people around the world to find us. Or you can always enjoy the show by visiting us at our website. Once again, hope you got it, jnf.org/IsraelCast. Now, it does indeed take a homo shop to put IsraelCast together. And for that, we thank Vivian Grossman, Dara Shapiro, and Olivia Schendel. Our editors are Jay Rothman and James Casada from Miratone Studios right here in the very heart of New York City. And that music that you hear at the top until the program is titled My Eden. It's by the very talented Rafi Malkiel from his album Water on the Tzaddik label. Now, IsraelCast is powered by Jewish National Fund USA, your voice in Israel. For more info about JNF USA, visit jnf.org. And if you'd like to write to us with story ideas or just to say howdy, each one of us would truly love to hear from you. So do email us at israelcast@jnf.org. Meantime, I'm Stephen Shalowitz, thanking you for tuning in and looking forward to having you join us on future episodes of IsraelCast.